Thanks, Frederick. Hopefully I can put sort of statistics like that in a bit of context and try and offer some understanding as to how we see cyber threats developing at control risks. So first of all, let me jump straight in, and I want to start by explaining the way we understand cyber threats, which is by looking at 3 broad categories of actors and 3 different types of attack. So starting with the threat actors, first of all, we see nation states as typically the best resourced and as a result the most capable types of actors. So this is predominantly intelligence agencies looking to conduct cyber espionage for a range of political, economic or security purposes, primarily by stealing information. There is a counter to that. We're also seeing an increasing number of states with both the intent and capability to conduct more disruptive acts. So that's looking to break systems, cause disruption, rather than just stealing information. Contrasting with those motives, we see cybercriminals with the primary motive of conducting operations for financial gain. We see a huge range of capabilities within this particular category. Some groups, the really sophisticated groups, have capabilities that exceed those of some nation states, whereas others only have really rudimentary skills and are very dependent on open source tools and poor cybersecurity standards and a lack of preparation and defenses on behalf of the organizations and companies that they target. We also look at cyber activists. So instead of that financial gain, these groups typically operate for political or ideological reasons, or to establish their notoriety or promote their cause. Most of these groups have very limited skill sets and are the least capable of these 3 categories of threat actors. So they compensate for this by trying to conduct highly visible attacks, to focus on targeting the reputation of companies and organizations. So in this category would include collectives like Anonymous, but also groups with more patriotic or perhaps nationalist affiliations, and also those that claim affiliation to Islamic State. So just in terms of the way we understand types of attacks, we see them being divided into 3 main types. So attacks on confidentiality will involve the theft of sensitive information. So this could be things like stealing bank account credentials. We see attacks on integrity, and this is something I'll come on to in a little bit more detail with a specific view to the trade finance industry. So we see attacks on integrity involve manipulating systems or information or changing data. So this could be something like manipulating payment data in order to induce a fraudulent transaction. And then last of all, we see attacks on availability. So this is disrupting or destroying processes. This could involve knocking a critical system offline, for instance, by using a distributed denial of service or what we call a DDoS attack to disrupt a website. So one of the trends that we're able to see from looking at the whole threat landscape and looking at those different types of attacks in the way we do is the increasing crossover between these categories of threat actors. I think previously, if you look maybe 4 or 5 years ago when capabilities were more nascent and there are less sophisticated groups out there, it was easier to differentiate between groups of threat actors, whereas now we see the lines becoming a lot more blurred, which makes attribution, which is defining who's responsible for a particular breach or incident, a lot more complicated. So, looking at the crossover between nation states and cyber activists, we see some states, such as Iran, North Korea, and Russia, are looking to conduct disruptive attacks while posing as cyber activist groups in order to achieve plausible deniability and avoid the political repercussions that will arise from their actions. So the November 2014 attack on Sony Pictures Entertainment is probably the most prominent example of this, in which North Korea posed as a cyber activist group called Guardians of Peace to avoid that political blowback. We also see other examples. For instance, there was an attack sponsored by the Russian state on the French broadcaster TV5 Monde, which involved knocking some systems offline. That was blamed on a cyber activist group that was affiliated to Islamic State. Again, gives them the opportunity to make a political point or project power while avoiding that blowback and those repercussions. We also see this crossover in terms of states with lesser capabilities, informally recruiting activists to supplement their operational capabilities. So we've seen Iran doing this in its efforts to target the US financial services sector, and we see it continue to use individuals and even hiring capability from private sector organizations to supplement its operations. So looking at the crossover between cyber activists and cyber criminals, due to the similarity of the skill sets required for a lot of the techniques and attacks these groups are conducting, we particularly see in regions where law enforcement capabilities with regard to cybersecurity, where they're limited, such as the Middle East, for an example, we see individuals split their time between financially and politically motivated activity. We also see cybercriminal activity justified on the basis of political motives. So if you spend a lot of time on Russian cybercriminal forums, you'll be able to see the way in which these criminals are embellishing their financially motivated targeting on the basis of political motives. So we see a lot of activity on those Russian forums targeting US companies and organizations, couching it in the language of attacking American imperialism and economic superiority. Just looking at the crossover between criminals and nation states, we see some of the most sophisticated criminal groups imitate the tactics that are typically associated with nation states. So this is primarily in the form of investing more resources in reconnaissance and preparation to enhance the prospect of success for an individual attack, and as a result maximize the potential revenue that they can get from an individual operation, though this also extends to copying or even buying tools that have previously been used in nation-state operations. I think the recent breaches of on the SWIFT network, which I'm sure everyone's familiar with, seem to represent an example of the way in which these threat actors are increasingly crossing over, making attribution more complicated. From the other direction, we also see sophisticated nation states using commodity malware, so that's malicious software that's widely available on cybercriminal forums, in order to get a foothold in a target network. Again, pushing to achieve that plausible deniability for their operations and passing off an incursion just as a cybercriminal operation, rather than the victim being able to attribute it to a nation state. We also see intelligence agencies and states with developing cybersecurity capabilities use those tools and adapt them for their own needs, so to steal information from specific targets, to conduct espionage on political dissidents or other targets of perhaps security interests, and to steal information from those individuals. So again, we've recently seen examples in South America and in South Asia, in those areas where capabilities are still developing. So as a result of this increasing availability of tools, which is predominantly resulting from cybercriminal activity, we see that it's been facilitated by developments in forums and marketplaces and other means of communicating on the deep and dark web, which have allowed cybercriminals to better interact with each other. So crucially, it's introduced and we think as well refined the profit motive for cybercriminal activity and creative incentives for cybercriminals to improve existing services and develop new ones. And so Grams, which is a search engine on the dark web, is just one example, and I'm sure the eagle-eyed among you will have noticed the similarity to Google. This is another trend we see in that they're looking to imitate what works on the surface web, apply that same business model, apply those same practices, and reap the profits as a result of their activity. And this is just one of numerous examples in which we see of goods and services being advertised that act as capability enhancers for cybercriminal groups. So another example, we see a lot of posts both advertising and requesting access to particular companies. So a cybercriminal will gain a foothold on the network of a target company in a particular industry, and then rather than exploiting that himself to steal data, he'll advertise that access on a cybercriminal forum to the highest bidder so that someone else can actually exploit the access to the data or the access to that network. These sort of trends, this sort of development ultimately allows otherwise unsophisticated actors to conduct these more sophisticated and potentially more impactful attacks on targets that would otherwise be beyond their reach. We also see threat actors sharing tools between criminal and activist groups, so that a greater number of ideologically motivated actors with otherwise limited skill sets are able to conduct attacks that result in greater impacts on their targets. The aptly named Exploit for Arab database is just one example of a platform that allows these tools to be shared, in that case between criminals and cyber activists in the Middle East. I think another interesting trend we're also seeing is a development in terms of the number of nation states with cyber espionage and cyber attack capabilities, which means you really have to look beyond the usual suspects, some of which I've already mentioned, when attributing attacks, or when you're looking at the threat profile that you face as an individual company. The barriers to entry to developing these capabilities for nation states are reducing. They can either be bought in from commercial spyware providers, you can hire hacker-for-hire groups or criminal third parties for individual operations or outsource that capability, or you can develop your own in-house capabilities. So these trends we really see complicating the threat landscape, meaning that companies and organizations can increasingly be targeted by a diverse range of actors with a huge range of very differing motives. So just to put these sort of broader developments and trends we're seeing in particular context for the trade finance industry. So as a result of these developments, we're seeing an increase in the number of attacks that primarily target the integrity of data as opposed to its confidentiality or its availability, while the sophistication of these attacks on integrity is also increasing, which brings with it an increase in the impact on companies and organizations. So this varies from what I call unsubtle attacks on integrity, and I think a particularly pertinent example of that would be a ransomware infection. So ransomware is a form of malware that infects a system. It encrypts it encrypts data. It can encrypt an entire system or endpoint, and it requires that the user pays a ransom in order to restore that device's previous functionality. So we're seeing a real increase in the sophistication of ransomware variants. We're seeing ransomware that's increasingly permanent in its impact on infected systems or data. I think a few years ago, again, a lot of the ransomware that was written was perhaps poorly constructed and easy to reverse or circumvent after you'd been a victim of it. That's no longer the case. We're also, we're seeing a reduction in the prospect of a business that has been infected by ransomware recovering that data. We also see variants of ransomware that are targeting new endpoints. So instead of just going after individual computers, they're going after entire businesses. They're targeting servers. We've even seen variants that are targeting websites. Again, combining that with an attack on the availability of a user's data or systems. And we're also seeing variants that are able to self-replicate after infecting a corporate network, meaning they can spread throughout your company, particularly if the network's not segmented, meaning they can bring whole departments or even businesses to a halt, rather than just infecting that individual user, again, increasing the impact of an attack and potentially having a broader impact and bringing about a crisis for the entire business. Moving beyond ransomware, we're also seeing increasingly subtle attacks on integrity that have the potential to undermine trust in the supply chains of entire industries. Obviously, trade finance, a pertinent example, particularly where trust is particularly integral to the normal functioning of that industry and normal business operations. So again, with cybercriminals increasing capabilities in the way in which they're imitating nation-state tactics, that means they can pick out specific targets within an organization down to the individual level. They can look to recruit insiders to assist with their operations, and then be patient, sit on a network, study usual traffic across the network, and then look to imitate or even manipulate that activity. So that approach has been particularly successful in the case of payment diversion fraud, and we're also seeing a trend towards threat actors investing greater resources in those individual operations, which again, I think the attacks on the SWIFT network have been a recent example. Those efforts to invest more resources in individual attacks to ultimately get a greater payoff, which obviously has more impact on the business itself. So to combat some of these threats on the integrity data and attempt to enhance trust and restore confidence in supply chains, I think we're increasingly likely to see the introduction of distributed ledger technology. So this is the database technology that underpins the cryptocurrency Bitcoin, and which it uses to verify transactions. So these sorts of measures are likely to be introduced with an ultimate view to reducing the threat that trade finance organizations face from these types of sophisticated fraud operations. However, this doesn't represent a silver bullet for the industry or for combating this type of fraud. We've always seen that sophisticated threat actors have always been able to observe and adapt to new security measures or defensive technologies, and ultimately overcome or even circumvent them, even if it means looking to exploit vulnerabilities at other points in the supply chain. So as a result of that adaptability, the increasing sophistication of threat actors and the way they constantly adapt new tactics, techniques, and procedures, we advocate an intelligence-led approach for being able to mitigate these evolving threats. So we refer to 4 types of cyber threat intelligence, which are defined by CERT UK. So that's the UK's Computer Emergency Response Team and the Centre for the Protection of Critical National Infrastructure in the UK. So just to go into these very briefly, technical threat intelligence is obviously a key component, but I think for too long, an intelligence-led approach to cybersecurity has been dominated by purely technical intelligence. This is sort of information on malicious IPs, information that you plug into an antivirus system or a firewall. But crucially, organizations need to look beyond this when trying to mitigate these evolving threats. You need to look at things like operational intelligence, which is details of specific incoming attacks, and this can be gleaned from research on the deep and dark web, particularly with regard to criminal and activist operations. You also need to understand the tactics, techniques, and procedures that these threat actors are likely to use, which involves tactical intelligence, so that in the event an attack does arise, you know how to recognize it and you know how to mitigate it, and that your staff are prepared. But ultimately, as I said, dealing with cybersecurity needs to go beyond just an issue for the IT team or the security team. You ultimately need buy-in from the board to be able to allocate resources within your organization. And this involves bringing in strategic intelligence. So this is high-level information delivered in plain English, and you're looking at the changing strategic risks and threats to your organization to ensure that you can get buy-in from the highest level and that it's understood that this is a business-wide issue rather than one exclusively for the IT team. So that's all I had to cover in terms of the slides. I'm aware we've got time for some questions. If I can just open it to the floor. Sorry, I think the microphone's just coming.
Thank you. Can I just ask a question about Bitcoin? You talked about obviously its development and its position with cyber criminals. Do you ever see it becoming a sort of a legalized currency at all?
That's a really interesting question. I think there's obviously big issues around the way it's perceived because of that, because of that close connection, I'd say, with cyber criminal activity. So obviously it's those Bitcoin and other anonymous cryptocurrencies have been a huge benefit for cyber criminals that are looking to, say, extort victims and extract ransoms. So yeah, they've been a massive boon for them. I think, as I sort of mentioned, I see the technology behind Bitcoin being increasingly incorporated into financial services and even other industries. But I suspect that sort of maybe the technology underpinning it will become more normalized, perhaps rather than the actual currency itself.
Thank you. That was very interesting. Turning to trade finance, as trade flows have speeded up, just-in-time deliveries, etc., and there's increased, obviously, computerization and digital traffic of trading, such as letters of credit, what would you say would be one or two of the major risks that companies involved in using such systems need to watch out for to avoid fraudulent activity in trade finance and indeed in trade itself?
It's an interesting question. I can't claim to be an expert specifically on trade finance, but I'd say social engineering attempts, and criminals are becoming increasingly sophisticated at using these. So this is essentially perhaps imitating other employees or other CEO, or perhaps a CEO or a head of accounts or someone senior within an organization to try and influence that employee to perhaps allow a transaction or oversee something they otherwise wouldn't. So I'd say awareness of social engineering efforts and how sophisticated they're becoming. And again, they're also incorporating reconnaissance. So as a cyber criminal, I may look on an individual employee's, say, LinkedIn profile. If there's anything particularly interesting, I can leverage when I send an email to them to try and convince them of its legitimacy. I think to sort of, in addition to that awareness, I think it's probably also important to look at things where possible, like two-factor authentication or two-step verification, to have those checks or balances in place, to be able to understand where perhaps a request for payment differs from perhaps your normal procedures, to be able to identify those incidents and respond and react accordingly.
One, would you be able to quantify the actual damages from cyber attacks so far, if there are any records? And second, there's a recent growth of insurance products covering, protecting against these type of attacks. How do you view the response from the insurance industry to protect companies from cyber attacks?
Yeah, it's a really interesting issue, and obviously those two questions are sort of interlinked, so I might take a stab at answering them together. I think obviously there is a huge amount of difficulty in quantifying the business impact of cyber attacks. I mentioned earlier, when you look at, say, cyber activist groups, they're predominantly targeting the reputation of organizations. Obviously, quantifying reputational damage from a cyber attack or any sort of incident in the business is incredibly difficult. So I think because of that and a number of other factors, there isn't that sort of industry-wide data. It's not being recorded. I don't think it's being recorded in a reliable enough fashion to be able to definitively pick out the cost of, say, an individual type of cyber attack, which obviously has implications for the insurance market. If you don't know your exposure to something, it's very difficult to be properly insured for it. I think one of the things we're increasingly seeing when we speak to insurers is, or one of the sort of emphases we put on firms is for individual firms, because every company or organization will be different, to try and understand the threat that they face, understand the value of their assets, and sort of look to do some scenario building and modeling to try and work out the specific damage that could occur in terms of financial costs as a result of a range of cyber attacks that company may or may not face. So I think that sort of push really has to come from individual companies understanding the value of their assets and the threat that is posed to those assets, rather than a more sort of generic industry-wide approach.
Have we got time for one more?
Yeah, I think we've got time for one more.
Just very quickly then, I wonder, there's a lot of talk in the press around financial services industry and banks in particular, their reliance on legacy systems. And I wondered whether you thought, in your experience, that leaves them particularly vulnerable to cyber attacks, or whether they're actually just facing different challenges from perhaps other manufacturing and other industry sectors?
Yeah, I think obviously there is a threat to those legacy systems, especially where there's vulnerabilities in those that are known and have been exploited previously. But I think for me that sort of connects to a broader issue about patch management. So I think in a lot of organisations they'll have, in financial services we see it as well. They have these systems in place that there are known vulnerabilities for, that threat actors, we see nation states and criminals in particular, having developed exploits for those specific vulnerabilities. But there isn't the impetus within those organisations to have really efficient cycles after those vulnerabilities are made public, and even after attacks, say, in other countries or on their competitors come to light. So I'd say that sort of legacy system issue ties in with that broader approach. Again, it comes down to being aware of those vulnerabilities, but crucially also knowing how they can be exploited by those threat actors. So it comes back to understanding your sort of threat profile. I think there may be time for one more quick one.
Just one more, please, briefly, Oliver. I have a question here from one of our delegates in Manchester, from Louise Byrne at Aon. If the deep, dark web is known, can it simply not be turned off?
Unfortunately, it's not quite that simple. There's a lot of things around. So, for instance, if I'm hosting a cybercriminal marketplace, I take many of the steps that someone hosting a legitimate marketplace, say an Amazon or an eBay site, would take to ensure my site stays up and doesn't go offline. So I'm investing in DDoS mitigation. I'm investing in what they call bulletproof hosting. So yeah, unfortunately, it's not quite that simple. And again, despite this sort of the sort of sinister undertones in the name dark web, and its obvious association with cybercriminal and other sort of nefarious types of activity, these functions do have legitimate purposes as well. I mean, Tor, looking back, to its initial inception, it was developed as a means for individuals to communicate anonymously and freely, sort of looking at principles of freedom of speech. But obviously, that can be sort of subverted and used for more nefarious purposes at the same time.
Thank you.
Great. I think that's all we got time for. So I'll hand over. Thanks so much.